actually the schools seem to do okay. I mean, it's not like, I mean, they've had some times in the past where they were worse. I don't think it equates school-wise to some areas in Chicago or Elgin. My biggest challenge for a district like East Aurora, biggest challenge is, I know them really well, it's small, so it has no economies of scale. All working class folks. The industry that would have developed there has turned into housing, and some of that is fairly dense in terms of numbers of kids, so it's at a great economic and financial disadvantage. I really like their current administration. I've met a number of the top people, including Dr. Pop. Again, I do business with East Aurora to the tune of $200,000 a year. So, I have pretty good, I watch pretty closely where they're at, and I do business with some of the same service providers that they do. Pretty well funded, the district, so a lot of that has to do with the stability of that area. So, it's an area where people who need a place to live. I say that I lived there for a number of years in East Aurora
Well, I
schools.
grew up on the east side,
Yeah.
so I went to Waldo and I went to Gates and Bardwell.
Yeah, it's a little bit different time now in
Sure.
terms of generation, but I mean, I lived in the 80s, I lived on Ridge Street, owned a house there for 7 years, lived there for about 3.
Okay.
And then I had a house on Trask, not down closer to New York, but up closer to Sheffer, near Simmons
Okay.
Junior High School for about 5 years. I lived there.
That's over by Simmons, right?
Yeah, very close to Simmons. And the office building that I manage is in East Aurora and over there, so I'm there all the time. I think it's like everywhere else. You just, you look at what's there and you make your decision accordingly. If you're talking about,
I'm looking to buy an investment property. I'm gonna offer them probably about $20,000 or $25,000 cash.
Yeah.
On State Street. It's in between Galena and Spring,
okay,
or New York and Spring.
yeah, I don't, in terms of,
It's missing the inside.
yeah, I was gonna say, I couldn't value it for you, kind of out of my head.
I'm not looking for value. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if there's things moving over there because it's not
Oh,
something
yeah, I think so. I think it's like everywhere else. I think, in the rental markets are strong, right? There are people there who are perfectly willing to work. Part of the question always is, are there jobs? And the answer is yes. There's always been plenty of jobs in the United States. We've never had a lack of jobs. The problem is they all pay minimum wage.
Right.
But people who live in places like East Aurora, who can pay $600, $700, $800 a month in rent as long as 2 or 3 adults in the house are working and willing to work for minimum wage, which means that they'll work jobs you and I won't.
Right.
And in the right price range for the tenants then, that makes them better tenants than you and I might be, because if we lost our jobs and the unemployment ran out, we might retire, quit, move, pick up stakes. They just keep working. So there's a lot to be said there. That kind of property in East Aurora wouldn't bother me in the slightest. I'll tell you what, the kind of housing property that would bother me in East Aurora is a brand new or recently constructed home in the 200,000 plus range
Right.
that you hope to hold for 5 years and sell for a profit. That ain't gonna happen
Not
because
over
there's
there,
no demand.
Right.
I've lived in newer housing there, and recently went back and visited one of our neighbors who sold after being there 22 years. So they're the sole owners of the house, bought a vacant lot in East Aurora for $74,000, had a what was their house, about 1,800 square feet, I think, plus a sub-basement, plus a full basement, and just sold it for $195. So, the house should have been worth closer to $275, but that $80,000 difference is probably because there's just no demand for really newer quality, top-notch housing, kind of the higher end of the East Aurora market.
Sure.
Another guy that I did business with, his wife built themselves a really nice 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch with a full basement over off of Mitchell and maybe Bilter or Metal or something that's over there.
Okay.
Anyway.
Close to the tollway?
Yeah, exactly. I can't remember what it's farther south. It's south of the tollway. But anyway, same thing, but they're going to lose money on the house just because it's over improved for that area.
Right.
So if you're talking about just ordinary working class folks housing,
Well,
then that kind of thing in East Aurora will play all the time. Just as long as you know what to pay for it, you'll do well.
I'm looking to probably offer this guy $20,000 or $25,000 on this house. The whole inside's missing. And I went and looked at it with a guy. He's like, we could probably throw about $20,000 to $25,000 in fixing up the inside, so have like 45 to 50 in there. And so my thought was possibly selling it for 80.
How many beds? How many baths? And there's a big difference in value between, say, a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom. Not so much because of functional utility, because that's true, but you hit a major difference in the rental market,
Okay.
which somebody who buys it may buy it for that, at that kind of, those kinds of numbers. A lot of people who need rental housing, who are like Section 8 or whatever, need that 3rd bedroom, and a lot of rental properties are 2 bedrooms and below.
Okay.
So you get all kinds of apartments that are 2 bedrooms, et cetera. So 3-bedroom is a rare bird in that area. So again, sometimes a smaller home with 3 smaller bedrooms will play better in that
Yeah.
space than 2 larger bedrooms. But it kind of depends upon what, you have to sort of look at what the market is you're going for and make that determination when you get there.
Well, with the condition of the house, if it has 2 bigger bedrooms, we can make it into a 3rd smaller.
Well, that's right. I mean, you might be able to do that. But I would just play with the numbers a little bit, and play with the market, and try to decide, again, from a sales standpoint, if you're selling to somebody who's got a brand new family, or just starting out, the 2-bedroom might work great. But if you got more kids, they might prefer
Right.
that extra division or separation. Or another adult living with them, which is very common in that area, where you've got, the kids, aunts, uncles, whatever, are
Right.
in the house, so you need that division. When I sold my last place in East Aurora over on Trask, it was a quad level also, just like my neighbors, and so we had different layout, but same basic idea. Anyway, so we had, in that sub-basement, which was all perfectly finished, and it's basically an English basement, and perfectly finished, and we had a really long family room that wrapped around the 4th bedroom. And that long family room was something we kind of used as an office. So I had gotten office partitions and used office partitions to divide that space off, so we had printers and computers and things there.
Okay.
We decided to leave those office partitions, which were worth a couple $100, because it gave the impression that that could be a 5th bedroom.
Okay.
And the family that moved in there, very large, lots of people, I'm sure they turned that into a 5th bedroom right away.
Gotcha.
So, again, it kind of depends upon the market, but larger family units need more spaces. And Aurora has restrictions. There's a number of sleeping rooms and how many people can sleep in those and whatever, so you might want to look at that too. It's 50 square feet per adult that you have to have. So
Yeah.
technically, in a 10 by 10 room, you can sleep 2 people in Aurora.
Right.
If it's 10 by 9, you're only allowed 1 person in that room.
Okay.
I don't know how much they enforce it, but that's been law in Aurora now for probably 10 years.
No, it makes sense, because over in that area, I'm sure you could get a lot of different scenarios going on.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing. It's a I don't I'm happy to just have a roof over my head kind of thing, right? I mean, the longer people are in the U.S., the longer the more we're accustomed to life here, the more we expect things to be a little more luxurious, a little roomier, a little bigger, a little better. For other folks, they're just thrilled to be alive and healthy and have some real basics. So, yeah, that law exists. It's kind of, I look at it as one of Aurora's many anti-Hispanic ordinances, but it's not really targeted for them. But if you're coming from Mexico, for example, where you're used to living in really small spaces, and you come here and you would happily put 3 or 4 kids in a 10 by 10 room with a couple of bunk beds, Aurora says you can't do that.
That's what I grew up in. I'm not Hispanic.
Right, but I'm just saying, but see, that's the change. See,
Right.
our 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th generation, white Americans look at that and go, oh, we shouldn't be living like that, because that's the way our great grandparents lived, and we're in better condition. So now we tell people you can't do that. And courts have typically upheld that to a degree, as long as it's somewhat reasonable. So,
Do you have a spare pen? I left mine in my car.
I might. Hang on just a second. I do have a pen. I just have to bring this up and get it active here. Otherwise, I'll forget. And I apparently can't find files and talk at the same time. I can't do 2 things at once.
Do you know what kind of information they'll disclose to me? Because I'm gonna.
You can keep this one if you want.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna file a
Sorry about
Freedom of
that.
Information Act, because before I make enough.
Well, so who owns the property? What kind of individuals?
The guy that owns it, I was talking to the listing agent today, he met me over there. He bought it in a bundle of different properties and decided that he was gonna buy a restaurant and rehab that, and so he's letting this one go. I don't know if that's the truth or not, but it doesn't really matter. All I wanna make sure is that they didn't have a meth lab or some crazy crap like that.
Well, that has to be disclosed. So if you look at, go back to chapter 4, that disclosure form that's there is all the things they have to disclose if they ever lived in it. If they didn't, then you maybe just want to contact the
No, he didn't.
local
He
paper.
bought it from the bank.
Yeah. So, well, if he bought it from the bank, he still has to disclose anything that he knows. The question is whether he knows anything. So,
Right.
yeah, I would just check the papers, you know.
I'm gonna fill out this form, it's called the Freedom of
Yeah,
Information
a
Act
FOIA,
for the police
yeah.
department.
I just don't know how long they take to respond to stuff.
Gotcha.
All right, other questions before we get started for the night? So tonight we're going to talk about real estate contracts. This forms the basis also of our discussions that will come up in chapter 17 when we talk about leases, because leases are contracts. And it also touches on some of the things we talked about in, say, chapter 6 when we talked about brokerage agreements, because those are contracts, those agency agreements. So they kind of fit it under the same, some of the same information in terms of basic contract law. So contract law in general is state common law. So contract law can vary somewhat from state to state, but for the most part, it's pretty similar, at least for the things that we're going to talk about, unless they're in Illinois specifics. Most of what we're looking at here is pretty universal. Now, before I get any farther, I just want to comment for those of you who might be familiar with, you don't have to know this for the class, but just in case you have some contract background, I always like to explain this. Because we're talking about state common law of contracts, we're not talking about anything at all that's included under what's known as the Uniform Commercial Code. So if you've ever heard of the UCC or done anything with that, that's for the sale of goods only, does not cover real estate, and it's usually between all business entities. So if you're in the business of selling grain or buying, flour, milled flour or something like that, UCC is a whole different set of contract rules. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about that we're going to deal with in real estate, and that you're typically going to be dealing with if you're buying a car or something. This kind of contract law will apply. But if you were, had some other previous life where you're dealing a lot with contracts on a business-to-business basis for the sale of goods, this is going to sound a little bit different because it is different. All right, so what is a contract? This is how I think of it. A legally enforceable set of promises between parties that you enter into voluntarily, and it can't be forced upon you, to do something legal, and you and all parties have to be legally competent, and it has to include some form of consideration. If it meets all those criteria, it's a contract. If it doesn't, it can't be, regardless of what the piece of paper it's written on says. So one basic important concept when you look at this is to understand it does not matter what the document says on the top. The document can say real estate sales contract, but if it's got a bunch of blanks in it and nobody signed it, it isn't a contract. So just keep that as an example in mind, that it doesn't make a difference what the piece of paper says. It's what the law would say as to whether it is or isn't a contract. It's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. Forms can say anything. Something can say it's a contract, but it only will be if it meets all of these criteria that we talk about this evening. So just like with agency agreements, there are several ways in which you can form a contract, right? With agency, we said you can have express written, expressed oral, or it can be implied through the actions of the agent. Here, contracts work the same way. The one thing that I'll tell you is that implied contracts is not something you're going to need for the state exam or in this course at all, but it's a possibility. So you really want to focus on express contracts, and that's one of two things, written or oral. Most everything that we do should be in writing. But if you go back to what we talked about in chapter 6 and think about buyer agency, where we talked about that kind of relationship either being implied or being an oral kind of arrangement, you could technically have an oral contract to act as an agent. The question is whether it's enforceable for a commission. In Illinois, it's probably not. As one of the MGM founders used to say, an oral contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. In other words, they're worthless. And so today, if you want to have anything at all of any value, you want this contract to be written. And I think I talked earlier a little bit about the idea of parole evidence rule in a previous chapter, where that's the idea that something that is oral will never supersede something that is written. So remember, when you or if you're working with a client is going to sign or enter into a contract that's written, that contract, that written contract will automatically eliminate any obligation of the other party or parties to perform on any oral promises that they made. Partially because the written contract will probably state this is the complete and entire agreement between the parties, but also because of the idea of parole evidence. Again, so it's very important to understand that whatever your client signs, whatever kind of purchase or sale agreement or lease they sign, that's the agreement. So if the landlord on some lease deal is telling your tenant client, yeah, you know, we'll take care of that build out afterwards, you sign this and move in, that landlord will have zero obligation to do that. Very important to understand that the written contract will always, even if there's some technical cases where it won't, for our purposes, we should think the written agreement always will supersede any prior oral agreements. Right? So again, the whole idea is you lay everything out. The great thing that an express contract can do is just give people something to refer to. Even well-intentioned people who like each other, who know each other, who are fond of each other, will sometimes forget what the basics of the terms are. I've done business over the years with a lot of friends, family, people I co-invest with repeatedly, and sometimes we'll do something like an oral agreement on a short-term loan. And people will forget the most amazing things, like how much money they borrowed in the first place. Seriously, you can't look up how much money we gave you? You know, what the interest rate was, what the repayment terms are. So when you do that today, it's a real simple thing. Here's a promissory note, you sign it and acknowledge the amount. And right there, what that does is give them something to refer to so that they don't get confused about what they owe or what their obligations are or when they're due. So that's the beauty of an express written agreement. More than all this thing, where it gives you the power to sue somebody, it just memorializes the intention of the parties. It's very valuable for that reason alone. We'll talk in a little bit about the statute of frauds and perjuries. This is a common law evolution that started in England 500 years ago or so, and the idea being that, again, certain contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable by a court. And ultimately, your contract is only valuable if you can force the other party to perform in some circumstances. And that's the idea of enforceability. So your contract may be legal, but if you can't use it to beat somebody over the head with, then you may not have had it, it may not have been worth anything to you. Right? So we'll come back to those, that idea in just a little bit. Contracts are usually bilateral. For real estate, most everything we're going to talk about is bilateral, but you can have some unilateral agreements as well. Bilateral, you can hear it in the word bilateral, two sides. You know, those of you who are football fans know that a lateral has to be thrown to the side or behind you. That's the idea. So two parties, a buyer and a seller, a client and a broker. That's the norm that we have in a contract. You can have multiple parties, multilateral contracts, but for our purposes, we're typically going to be talking about bilateral contracts. So each party has made some kind of promise, some kind of voluntary promise in exchange for consideration. So what kind of promise does a buyer make? What are they going to do?
Give you money.
They're going to pay money. So what's the promise on behalf of the seller? Since the seller isn't paying money, what is the seller doing?
Conveying a deed.
Yeah, they promise to make the conveyance, right? You can have my property and I get your cash. That's the basic idea, you know, between the other. Unilateral contract, unilateral, one-sided, is where one party obligates themselves to act, and there is no other party obligated to act. But if another party does act, then you have a contract. So a simple example of that is that you put posters all over Sugar Grove that say, you know, $5 reward for the return of my lost cat Fluffy. Nobody on the planet is obligated to go out and find Fluffy. And if they do find Fluffy and notice that it's her, they don't have to return her unless they stole her in the first place. They have no obligation to do that. But if they do, if they're aware of this offer you made and they bring Fluffy to you, you are now obligated to cough up the $5. That's a unilateral contract. So the one case where we see unilateral contracts in real estate fairly consistently, or unilateral provisions even within a contract, are options. Under an option agreement, you have one party who is obligated to act, but only if the other one exercises their option. We'll come back to that in a minute. So terms executed and executory might be a little bit different than what you would have expected. Executory, I'll start with that one, is an open and ongoing contract. It's in process. So a listing agreement while the house is for sale is an executory contract. A lease, while it's a valid, viable, hasn't yet expired, and the tenant is current with their rent lease, is an executory contract. A contract is considered executed once all of the promises have been fulfilled. It's done. So we sometimes will say something like, yes, I have executed the contract, when really what the person is trying to say legally is that they have executed their signature on the contract. When you have signed a contract that does not make it executed, what makes it executed, a real estate sales agreement, well, at what point, let me ask you, at what point in time is a sales contract fully executed? At the closing, right? When the money and the deed have changed hands. So we only execute our signature when we sign something. The contract is actually executed when all of the promises have been fulfilled, or for some other particular reason it's been rescinded, or there's been an accord and satisfaction or something else that modifies it along the way. So an executed contract, again, is all the promises have been fulfilled. Executory, as I say here, open and ongoing. And maybe more important for when we talk about leases, it's probably a good idea to understand that executory contracts are subject to being discharged in bankruptcy. So if you pay attention to the business pages at all, you could notice, or may have noticed, that some of the largest real estate related bankruptcies are typically retail operations like Kmart, who are trying to get out from underneath their long-term lease. Because you can have 20 and 30-year lease obligations for stores that are losing money. How do you get out from underneath that? That could be a long time of not being able to get away from that. Filing bankruptcy allows those tenants, those major retailers, to go into the bankruptcy court with a new plan that says, we're going to buy out of this lease early. We don't want to pay for another 20 years because we're losing money. We're going to close that store. We're going to keep these other stores open. And the landlords are usually stuck with that at that point in time. They'd rather take something rather than nothing. As long as it's reasonable, the bankruptcy judge will usually approve whatever the trustee has said makes the most sense for the whole creditor pool. So having a long-term lease as a landlord is only good if the tenant doesn't file bankruptcy, because at that point they might walk from the remaining term. All right, in order for a contract to be valid, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of essential elements here. We'll talk about the details of each of these, but again, all of these things, kind of in that list of 5, all have to exist for it to be a contract. So one is offer and acceptance, also known as mutual assent or meeting of the minds. You don't really have to have a give and take negotiation to form a contract, but technically there will be an offer and there will be an acceptance. And it's very important to understand who is who. So the offeror is the party that makes the offer, and the offeree is the recipient of it. Right? This is typical in the language of the law. The OR is the doer of the deed, and the EE is the recipient of that action. So the offeror is the party who makes the offer, and the offeree is the person who receives it. I shouldn't say accepts it, but receives it. You can also have a counter offeror, so the offeree, if they make a counter offer, can become the counter offeror, and then the person who made the original offer is now the counter offeree. I don't know if you get tested on terms like that. I think it's a little confusing, but it doesn't hurt if you understand and follow that bouncing ball. So now let's just assume that we have an offer in place, right? So we've got a party who's making an offer on a house. So a buyer, right? The buyer would make the offer, right? The initial offer, and the seller is the recipient of that, is the offeree. So when the buyer makes an offer and says, I'll buy your place for $200,000, how many options does the seller have, and what are they? Yeah, you can accept, or you can reject, or you can counteroffer, or you can kind of stonewall. I mean, lenders do kind of do that, just sit and wait, I guess. But really, the action choices accept, reject, and counter. So if you were to accept that offer, what's the simplest, easiest, cleanest set of words you could say?
Accept.
Yeah, yes, I'll take it. That would be the shortest, simplest thing. If you don't want it, if you want to reject, what's the shortest, simplest, easiest thing you can say?
Nope.
No. So those are quite, the opposite of one another. So what then exactly is a counteroffer? What would you say with a counteroffer? What would be the first thing or things you would say? The first word is the same as one of the ones you've already mentioned.
Yes.
Now you're going to say no, but. You have to say no, but. So a counteroffer really isn't a separate thing. You can call it that. You can say, and it's right to say I can accept, I can reject, or I can counter. That's an accurate statement. But you could also say you only have two choices. You can accept or you can reject. Because a counteroffer is really a rejection coupled with a brand new offer going in the other direction. That's really what it is mechanically. Right? So when I make that offer on Sunday night, say I'll buy your house for $200,000, and the seller says, yes, what do? We run around and we sign up all the paperwork. If the seller says no, and that's all they say, I got no idea as a buyer, right? Don't know what to do next. Got to talk to my agent, figure out, and that's as an agent, that would be your job, help them figure out, do you make a different offer, or how do you handle that? Now let's just say, using the accept-reject model alone, that on Sunday night, we make an offer of $200,000, and the seller says no, and then Monday morning, before the start of the next business day, the seller wakes up, they're in a cold sweat, and they realize, oh, we should have accepted that offer. Can they go back now and accept that?
Yeah.
Well, technically not really, because there's no longer an offer. As soon as they said no, there's no offer on the table. They can go back and they can make a new offer going in the other direction, right? They can call them up and say, okay, we'll take that, but it's not, you can't force the buyer anymore to perform because you've had a rejection. So the risk of counteroffering poses the exact same thing. If you counteroffer and say, no, but we'll take 210, and then the buyer goes, no, I'm not paying that, and walks away and doesn't negotiate any further, is there any way to bind that potential buyer at that point? No. And that's an important thing to understand. Even when it feels right, even when it feels like things could just sort of click and fall right into place, something can happen on the other side. They find another property, they get cold feet, their financing falls through, they just get busy and disappear for a couple of weeks. Whatever might happen can happen, and until you've got that thing signed up and all the initials and all the signatures are in place, you got nothing. Now, we'll talk about this just a little bit more here, but let's also point out that acceptance and rejections need to be clear and unambiguous. So you're talking to your buddy, and the buddy says, yeah, I'm selling my place, and I want $200,000 for it. Hey, would you pay me $200,000? And you say, okay. Do you have a contract or not have a contract?
No. You have an offer.
Well, what about when you said, okay, what is that? Is it clear and unambiguous?
No.
No. So you wouldn't be able to say that there's a contract there. So this is the kind of thing where it's important to understand, communication. Oral contracts really aren't something we're going to see a lot, but it is possible to have communication back and forth by email. And if you're somebody's agent and you're communicating with the other agent about an offer and counteroffer, be careful the words you choose. Don't leave them with the impression that you've formulated an agreement if you're still in the middle of negotiating. Make sure it's very clear what's happening at that point. You don't want to be in the middle of a lawsuit where the other side says, hey, we thought we had a deal, and here's the writing proving it because we have this trail of emails from your agent. And then there's got to be some kind of timeliness. So let's talk about this a little bit. This timeliness is kind of a nebulous sort of thing, but time in and of itself and how it works with contracts is also a challenge. So let's go back and look at our Sunday night deal where we've got this property and the buyer says, I'll pay you $200,000, and the seller's thinking, oh my God, that's a great deal. The house isn't worth anywhere near that. I never thought we'd get anything near this. And then the seller thinks, oh, well, I don't know. Maybe I don't want to tell him right away that I'm going to accept it. How long is that buyer's offer good for? If the buyer doesn't put any timeline on there, how long can the seller sit on that deal knowing they're going to take it? before the buyer could say, we never heard from you, we went and bought something else? It's a couple hours, a couple days, a couple weeks, what do you think? There's no statute in this regard. It's all sort of common law, what a court thinks, sort of what's reasonable, what's customary. What you should recognize as an agent is if your buyer has an offer out there, say it's a short sale where there's a bank involved, and the banks can take forever to consider these things, or it's a foreclosure where the bank's trying to hold, they've already taken the property back, and REO is a better term for that, where they've already taken the property back and they're trying to sort of collect offers before they go back and respond to some people. If your buyer needs to know, and if they're not going to get an answer until they can move on, you need to send a written communication just to be clear that whatever offer they had submitted is off the table, or is now subject to their confirmation because a certain amount of time has gone by.
Would it be acceptable to put in that email that you need a confirmation within 48 hours?
Certainly it would be. Now let's talk about what kind of thing can happen here. Not necessarily that specifically, but just in general about what timelines mean in contract offers. So same deal, an offer is made for $200,000 on a place where the seller is just thrilled to get this. Well, let's forget about that part. Let's say, so the buyer makes the following offer. Buyer says, I'll buy the property for $200,000 and my offer is only good for 10 days. Or my offer is good for 10 days, I should say. Yeah, either way. And the seller decides, well, I'm not sure, I'm going to talk to some people or whatever, and they're thinking about it, and on the 9th or 10th day, they're about ready to make their decision to accept this, and the buyer sends them a telegram or delivers a fax or sends a bicycle messenger or whatever that says we withdraw our offer. Can you put an offer out that says my offer is good for 10 days and then withdraw it on day 8 or day 9, for example? What do you think?
I'd say no, but how is it going to be enforced?
So Ken's question is, how do you enforce that? And the answer is you can't. Therefore, they can withdraw it at any time. So remember, to make a contract, you have to have consideration. An offer is a promise not supported by any consideration. So if I state to anybody in the room here, hey, if you don't worry about your money problems because I'm going to give you my house. It's an unenforceable promise. Now, if I say I'll sell you my house for $1,000 and we put it in writing, now we've got an enforceable deal. Even if I put in writing, I will give you my house, that is not an enforceable promise. So there's no way you can bind me to that. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about with I'll leave my offer open for 10 days. An offeror can withdraw an offer at any time for any reason or no reason whatsoever, unless that offer was somehow supported with consideration, which our offers typically are not. So we don't typically see that kind of thing. What the buyer was really saying was kind of what Ken was alluding to, is my offer is only good for 10 days. On day 11, you know it's no good. But any time before you accept, I have the ability to withdraw. So this also gets down to notice. Who notifies who first? Buyer and a seller. Buyer makes the offer for $200,000. Seller wants to accept. They're giddy with excitement. Buyer says, I'll leave my offer open for 10 days. And the seller says to his agent, here's everything. I've signed everything. I've signed exactly it. All the I's are dotted. All the T's are crossed. Everything is done. Deliver this to him on day 9. So the seller has signed all the documents. Everything's in writing. And hands it to his agent and says, on day 9, deliver this to that buyer. Now the buyer sends notice, sends a telegram on day 8, we're withdrawing our offer. Do we have a contract?
No.
Or do we not have a contract? Why do we not have a contract when the seller signed it all and told his agent that he's going to do the deal?
Both parties need to sign the contract.
Well, the buyer signed it when they made the offer. Well, really is kind of the question of who notified who first. If the seller can notify their own agent, that's fine, but they need to notify the other party or the other party's agent. So if the withdrawal comes before the will accept comes, then you have no contract. If the will accept it gets to the buyer before the it's withdrawn gets to the seller, then you've got a binding deal. Now there is something known as the mailbox rule, and it doesn't really probably occur very much anymore, but it is possible that the Postal Service can be viewed as the agent of the parties. So if the seller puts that acceptance in the mail, even though the buyer doesn't have it yet, and the buyer tries to withdraw, the seller might be able to prove, no, we gave it to your agent, the United States Postal Service. Doesn't always hold up, and I'm not sure how it works buyer to seller, seller to buyer exactly, and you're not going to get tested on it, but it's a good thing to understand because this can also work for crossing emails, faxes, other kinds of things where a notice comes together really closely. Again, the basic idea is who got notified of which action first as to how that's going to time out. All right, so any questions about any of that in terms of offer, acceptance, rejection, counteroffer, that kind of thing? Ultimately, the parties have to have agreed. So long as there's a firm agreement, then that's one of the essential elements. Consideration is something of value between the parties. It does not have to be money. I'll trade you my 1964 and a half Studebaker for your house. Okay. That's supported by consideration. Consideration in some kinds of contracts, though not in Illinois and not in real estate contracts, might be love and affection. You know, a contract to give a family member something. I'm going to give this to you, I'm going to do this for you because I've been the recipient of your love and affection for all these years. That can bind contracts in some states. It won't in Illinois. Again, it has to be clear, it has to be definite. The normal amount of money, you know, whatever the contract is will be stated, but technically, legally, all it has to be is something relatively sufficient, and you can have a technical amount like $10. Texas, I think the minimum for that is $100, but something that just establishes that the parties intended to sign a contract, even if the actual value of the contract is to be determined later. Parties must be legally competent, which means in Illinois you have to be how old?
18.
18. That'll be the same thing when we get to deeds, and it'll be the same thing when we get to wills. That's the age of majority, 18 or over. And legally competent in mental capacity form. So not drunk, not suffering from dementia. As our population ages, we're going to run into more and more of these sorts of challenges. And with different forms of dementia appearing, we're finding cases where people are probably not legally competent at one time of day, though they are at another. Cases where people fatigue, for example, they get up in the morning, they're refreshed, and they're of sound mind and body. But later in the day, not so much. So if you're in that situation where you have a client who you suspect maybe isn't all there at the time they're entering into agreements, understand this. If they don't have the mental capacity, if they're not legally competent, whatever you've got, a brokerage agreement, a sales agreement, a lease, whatever, it's probably worthless. Or it could be if it's challenged by the other by that party or their legal representative or an heir or somebody else like that who has some kind of an interest in the deal. Yeah, so that's it. I mean, fairly common to get questions about age in particular and about the right to void contracts, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. There must be reality of consent, and this is what I was talking about when there has to be a real meeting of the minds. So, again, it has to have been voluntary. You can't be duped or tricked into signing a contract. It's not binding. And if there's a mistake, you might be able to get out. Now, there are lots of different types of mistakes. Mutual mistakes, where both parties will agree, is easy to unwind. The parties either just modify the contract or agree to go their separate ways. But where one party perhaps has made a mistake, it can matter what kind of mistake and who the party is. But a clear error, for example, will not be upheld by a court. Let's say, for example, that your sales contract is for $250,000, and somebody, when they're preparing the contract, mistakenly puts in $25,000. That's not going to be a binding agreement. The court is going to either unwind that, or they're going to make it for the $250,000 that was intended based upon whatever the evidence is.
That'd be a nice gift.
Yeah, well, that's the point. Now, if the difference is from $250,000 to $240,000, that's a different matter. As long as the consideration seems to be sufficient, a court's going to leave it alone. Courts do not want to reform or get in the middle of contracts. That is not their job. In Illinois, in fact, that's really never happened. Some states will allow that, or for the court to rewrite a contract. But basically, that doesn't happen. It either stands or it doesn't. Sometimes they'll void a provision rather than an entire agreement. But courts don't like to reform contracts typically. Any kind of misrepresentation, negligent, accidental, case I gave you earlier where, you thought that house had a new roof, turns out it didn't, but it was an accidental thing, that may mean you don't have a valid contract if it's discovered while the contract is executory. Fraud, somebody outright lied to somebody. No, this place didn't have a meth lab. No, there's no old mine underneath this property that might subside and your house collapse into a pile of rubble. If you know that kind of thing, if you find that kind of thing out during the contract, then it's going to be void because there's no reality of consent. Undue influence, which could include duress. This does not have to be from the other contracting party or one of the agents. This can be from somebody completely on the outside. So the following sort of example is something that does happen from time to time. I've not seen this unwind, but it could. It's kind of textbook sort of case. You have a lot of situations today where you have 80 and 90-year-old adults, perfectly, competent, capable, whatever, but their 50, 60, and 70-year-old children are saying things to them like, Mom, Dad, you have no business living on your own anymore. I've got a colleague whose 88-year-old father-in-law fell off a ladder and broke his hip when he was trying to do some work 2 years ago. Still does that stuff today. Lives by himself, climbs up all around, does all the same stuff he did when he was 40. That kind of behavior by older parents sometimes drives people in my age range crazy. How do you keep them safe? Well, if you were to berate somebody like that, your parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, whatever, into listing a house or agreeing to sell a house, and before that thing closed, they were to go to a court and say, I never even wanted to sell this place in the first place. I'm just doing this because the kids are making me. Even though that's not the buyer's fault, not the buyer's agent's fault, that could be enough to get out from underneath the contract because there's no reality of consent. They weren't entering into it voluntarily. So if you see that kind of situation where older children, if you will, are trying to convince the parents or a parent to get out of the family house, just understand that if there's enough pressure there, that may not necessarily be the best situation. All right, any questions about any of this so far?
What does duress mean?
Well, duress is usually specifically when somebody forces you to do something. So you want to buy that investment property in East Aurora, you offer the guy 25 grand, he won't do it, and so you threaten to kick his dog. That's a very direct, case of duress. I mean, something more violent would be even a better textbook case, if you will. That's, not all that common. Duress is something you'll see on, a TV law kind of program, right?
Send them a message that the house might not be there.
Yeah. All right, so again, for the contract to be valid, the purpose of it has to be legal. If you want to go out and hire somebody to do me in by the end of the course because you're tired of all this work I'm making you go through or my lectures are confusing, that's your prerogative, I suppose. You probably wouldn't be the first students to want to do that. But if the hitman fails, you pay them the 5 grand cash, and then they don't do their job, or they take the money and run off to Indiana or wherever, and you go to sue them in court, you've got no standing. You have no contract, no matter how well written it was. It's not for a legal purpose. The cases where I've seen this in real estate tend to revolve around leases and a zoning problem, where the tenant can no longer be conducting the business that they intended to conduct. So a real simple example of this, in Aurora has a zoning regulation that you cannot have like a charity drop box with signs and publicity and things all over the place in the front of a building. They want them, unless the zoning specifically allows it, they want them in back. They don't want them seen from the street. And so I entered into an agreement at one time where a nonprofit, instead of having a drop box, would have a van, a truck with a man in it, 8, 9 hours a day, every day, 5 days a week. So that when people drop stuff off, it would be immediately put into the van. There would be no mess. The city also has an ordinance that you can't have commercial vehicles parked up near the street for free advertising, violating their sign ordinances. So I got a cease and desist letter basically from the city. It wasn't really quite that nasty or direct, but basically saying that what we were doing violated the zoning ordinance. And I was charging this nonprofit $100 a month because I wanted an agreement. I wanted there to be something in writing so that each party would know what their status was. They were happy with that. And then, of course, as it turned out, we had no legal lease anyway, because they couldn't be there to do what they were doing. So at the end, they hadn't paid us for the last few months' rent, and I didn't really care, which is fine, because I couldn't have enforced it anyway. How would I have enforced it? Because it wasn't for a legal purpose. We thought it was initially, but it turned out not to be. Public policy. This is a little bit nebulous, and again, not something that you should be expected to know for the state exam or my final. But if something is perhaps not obviously illegal, but violates some bit of public policy, the contract may also be void or not a valid agreement. Can't even come up with a good example at the moment. Yeah, although that may not be illegal, but I'm just trying to think, something that would be unconscionable, for example. So, you might have had public policy issues with, say, racial incidents prior to civil rights laws. Before there were enough statutes and federal laws in the 1960s that clearly defined individual civil rights, some courts might have struck down certain, I don't know if it's really even Jim Crow laws, but just certain actions and activities as being unconscionable, hence against public policy. It's that kind of thing. All right, so the statute of frauds, or statute of frauds and perjuries, exists in some form in every single state in the country, even though this evolved from English common law in the 16th century, I think. The idea of this was to prevent the courts from being unwitting accomplices in fraudulent activities of hucksters, con men, whatever. So you could have a deal specifically in less sophisticated times where who would win the court argument would be who was the better liar or the better storyteller. And so courts decided no more of this he said, she said stuff. Put it in writing. If it's not in writing, we're not going to hear the case. And then establish a range of contract types that must be in writing for them to be enforced or enforceable by a court. And real estate sales agreements are in that category. So no matter how well documented or how many witnesses you have between, of the oral agreement between two parties to sell a place or whatever, that is not going to be heard by a court. The court ultimately, which would really rather hear the case than not, is going to say, without it being in writing, it's a statute of frauds problem, and we have no right, really, to hear it. Long-term leases. Any contract that can be done performed in less than a year, like short-term leases, could be oral and be enforceable. But any long-term lease, meaning a year or longer, also cannot be enforced if it's oral. So these things really need to be in writing. These are the two things. So, and you could get a test question about this. It's the statute of frauds or statute of frauds and perjuries that requires certain contracts, including long-term leases and including sales agreements, that they must be in writing in order for them to be enforced. So technically, you can have a contract that is legal between the parties, but cannot be enforced. That's the idea of something being unenforceable. The contract isn't necessarily void. It's not necessarily illegal. It's not necessarily invalid. It's just worthless. Can't do anything about it. I've been involved in one statute of fraud case locally here where it went to a hearing. It was at a hearing basically to decide if there was going to be a trial or whatever, and the judge just finally, after a bunch of testimony over a period of an hour, just said, "This is statute of frauds. I can't rule on this," which then led basically to an immediate eviction of a tenant who was trying to prove that there was an agreement contrary, that there was an agreement even though there wasn't one. All right, contract status is something you'll get asked questions about along the way, whether it's on our test or the state exam, and it's helpful to know in practice about, what the status of something is. So some of these words are a little bit funny to me. A valid contract is just a contract. When you get a contract together for the sale of your house, you don't run to the neighbors and say, "Hey, look, I've got a valid contract." You just say, "I got a contract on my house." But that's what it would be if it has all the essential elements that we just got done talking about. That's a valid contract. A contract that's void isn't a contract. Doesn't matter what it said, it never was a contract, it's just void. It's missing some essential element. There's no consideration. It's not for a legal purpose. Something is missing. Turned out it was based on a mistake. So when you're looking at these scenarios you'd be given, bless you, think about it from that standpoint. Is it a contract or is it not a contract? If it's a contract, it's valid. If it's not a contract, it's void. Never was a contract, no matter what the document said. A contract that's voidable or avoidable, depending upon what law textbook author you read, has all the essential elements, but one or both of the parties has the right to declare it void, usually for test question purposes because they're under the legal age. Or perhaps it's turned out that there's a mistake and now somebody can decide, oh, should I go forward with it or not? Or mental incompetence. So let's use the example of a minor. If you're less than 18 and you enter into an agreement that is considered to be for a necessity, you might still be obligated to perform. Buying a house is not a necessity. A 17-year-old who rents an apartment, for example, to go to school at Northern may well be bound by that because it's a necessity to have some place to live. But if they're buying a condo and financing it, both the finance agreement and the purchase agreement could be declared void by them up until the time they turn 18 or a reasonable time thereafter. That reasonable time is generally considered to be about 6 months, from what I understand. This is one of the reasons why minors by themselves can't have a checking account. They can just change their minds. So if your 16 or 17-year-old's going to have a checking account, then the parent's going to end up being a signer, somebody that the bank can go to who can't weasel out of those obligations. Mental incompetence is a little funny from a test question standpoint because it can come and go. So going back to that case of somebody who's alert and refreshed and mentally sound in the morning, but by evening they're not because their brain is getting tired or whatever, and things just kind of start to turn to mush, I guess. If you enter into an agreement with that person in the evening when they're not mentally competent, and you take the test of whether what the status of that contract is at that same time or under that same mental condition, it would be void. They were incompetent when they entered into it. They're incompetent today. That agreement is void. It lacks capacity to contract. But if they sign the agreement in the evening when they're not of sound mind, and then in the morning when they're considering it, it's not void at that moment, it's voidable. If they happen to luck into a good deal, the law is not going to force them to walk away from it because they were incompetent, meaning drunk or whatever, during the time they entered into it. Now, once somebody is of sound mind, they have the right to consider, do I want to continue or do I not? And if they choose, while they're of sound mind, to continue, now you have a valid agreement. If they choose not to, it can be voided or avoided at their sole discretion. So that's, it gets a little funny from a test question, because you could write 100 of those questions, create all kinds of interesting sounding scenarios. The likelihood of you running into that is fairly slim, but again, you might get tested on that. So it's important to understand the difference between something that's void and voidable. Questions about that at all? And then there's the issue of enforceability, which I already mentioned. Usually, again, we're talking about something that's an oral agreement, seems to be appropriate, but you can't enforce it. All right, talking about discharge of contracts, lots of ways to do that, to get them from executory to executed. Performance is the greatest way. Everybody just does what they say. What they said. Right? And it's a series of promises to do something or refrain from doing something. So whatever I promise to do, I'm going to do it. And if the other party does the same, everybody performs, and voila, you now have an executed contract. These duties and obligations should be clearly spelled out in the agreement. It's one of the reasons why we use standard real estate contracts for residential, so that it's pretty simple for those of us who are real estate agents and legal novices to know what the basic obligations are from deal to deal to deal, because they're largely the same. This concept of time is of the essence, you should note that that's in the contract form. Time is sometimes a bit of a nebulous thing. Well, what happens if I don't apply for financing right away? Well, what happens if I don't get my inspection done right away? I'm still interested in the house, but I didn't do it in 5 days or in 10 days. We put this statement as kind of a catch-all to make the clear point that time matters, that the clock is ticking, and you don't have forever to do this stuff. And then when you read this contract agreement, you should notice that many of these obligations to perform, such as a buyer's obligation to get an inspection done in a timely manner or apply for financing, are all spelled out within certain very clear and specific time frames. 5 business days, 8 calendar days, whatever. And if you fail to meet those timelines, you're in breach, because time is of the essence. It's a way to state time matters. Otherwise, really, what's the value of time? It's kind of hard to prove that. And ultimately, if you end up in court, one party or the other, trying to sue to get damages, you usually have to prove those damages. How do you prove the value of time in something like a sale between two consumers? Very difficult to do. So again, this statement, time is of the essence, puts some teeth in the contract as it relates to performance and timeliness. Another way to perform under a contract or to discharge a contract is to assign your rights to somebody else. I know I have an obligation to buy your house and close, in the middle of March, but I can't do it, but my friend here will. If assignment is a right that's given to you, actually that's more of a delegation, but it's oftentimes referred to as an assignment. If that's acceptable, you can do that. A really common case of assignment in real estate is the sale of a loan in the secondary market. So you go to a local bank and you take out a mortgage loan and you start to make payments, and 2 or 3 months in you get a notice that your loan is now being serviced by somebody else and is owned by somebody else. That's an assignment. They just assign their rights, which is to do what? Collect the money, basically, to somebody else. Perfectly permissible. Unless it's prohibited in the contract, it's allowable. Delegation, sometimes in real estate class coursework and licensing, it's referred to in the same way as assignment. But this is more of a case where you have duties, where you say, well, okay, well, I can't make my mortgage payment, so I'm going to delegate that duty or that obligation to somebody else. Delegation is oftentimes not allowed. And even if you do delegate your obligation to somebody else, you may still remain liable. So again, I wouldn't worry about delegation, but the general concept of assignment is something you might get tested on. Unless the contract prohibits it, assignment is permissible. And the ideas of assignment and delegation come back again in Chapter 17 when we're talking about leasehold interest. Novation. Tear up the contract and replace it with a brand new one. I can't perform, but my friend can perform. Tear up my contract and enter into a contract with my friend. Again, a lease is a good example of that. Sign a 2-year lease on a really cool exclusive property, get transferred 2 months into it. What are you going to do? Well, if you found a replacement tenant, and if the landlord would accept them, they could let you out of the contract in exchange for you providing this new tenant. That's a novation. Either a substitution of a party or parties, or a complete tear up and start over of a new contract. You see that nova means new, right? So the whole idea is that, it's built right into the root of the word. It means new. So that's a way to just discharge the agreement. A breach of contract is another way to get rid of the contract, but in kind of a crummy and problematic way. Breach of contract, contracts being promises, a breach being a break, broken promises. Somebody is not doing what they promised. Somebody is completely failing to perform under the terms of the agreement. You have no excuse legally. What can the buyer do? What can the seller do? It kind of depends on what we're looking at. So, again, we'll talk more about breach of contract under leases, because there's very specific remedies under there. Here, if if the seller decides to breach, what can the buyer do about it?
Sue for damages?
Possibly. How do you prove damages if you're the buyer of a property? If you're the buyer of a piece of property, how do you prove damages when the seller just says, I'm not going to sell it to you? What if you got a lease with 3 months left to go and you were buying early because you wanted to have some extra moving time and the only thing you're going to lose is extra moving time? Are there really any monetary damages there? Kind of hard to say. And is it worth the time, effort, and energy to sue somebody who maybe the only reason they're refusing at the end to not sell you is because they don't know where they're moving? We're not typically dealing with deep-pocketed individuals, and litigation is usually a course of or remedy of last resort. So the buyer has a remedy. It's called a lawsuit for specific performance. It's an equitable remedy rather than a damages kind of or monetary remedy. And specific performance is where you go to the court and you say, Your Honor, we're not looking for damages. We're looking for you to enforce the party, the seller, according to the exact terms of the contract. Specifically, we want them to perform. So a seller who says, "Well, I'm not going to close because I don't know we couldn't find a house." A court could say, "Tough. Get a motel room, rent an apartment, stay with your neighbors. We don't care. Get out." And force the sellers to do what they promised. You can file a lawsuit for an anticipatory breach of contract if you believe that the seller is not going to show up at closing. But normally, that kind of specific performance suit probably happens after the closing when they don't show up or they send you a notice that they're refusing to close. Sellers' remedies are multifold. They also have the right to sue for specific performance. I'll explain in a minute why that's kind of a worthless right. But the seller's holding on to something else. What does the seller have? They probably have earnest money. They probably have some kind of cash deposit, and that's one of their options. So the seller has the right to go after the buyer's earnest money. We'll talk about earnest money again here in just a little bit. But that's their best remedy. So again, specific performance also works for a seller, but let me explain to you here why it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Tom wins the lottery, or he thinks he's got the winning ticket for $1 million cash. So he goes out on the weekend and he enters into a written contract, very clearly, completely written agreement to buy the place for $1 million. House of his dreams. Thrilled. Wakes up on Monday and looks at his ticket again and realizes he won $150, not $1 million. Not too bright. What do you expect? Yeah. So now what's that contract worth? He signed a binding contract. Maybe put up his life savings and earnest money in anticipation of getting this windfall lottery payout that he now knows absolutely for certain he's not going to get. So if that seller, that home builder, whomever, decides to sue him for specific performance and nobody will loan him the money based upon his current income, what good is a judgment? Worthless. So it's not really, it exists technically, but it's one of those blood out of a turnip kind of things. If you can't force the other party to perform, then that equitable remedy isn't really worth a whole lot. Hence the earnest money, that's really what it does for us. So we'll talk about that again in a little more detail as we go along, but because it forces the buyer to put something up. The seller has put something up, right? They put up the property. The buyer has to sort of put up, yeah, we'll buy it. So the cash at some level is then the seller's best option to go after. And there are some limitations on lawsuits for performance. I don't think you'll see any of that on any of your test stuff here. It can vary a little bit depending upon what it is, depending upon the contract types. Not only is there a statute of limitations on contract issues, but there's also a statute of repose. So statute of limitations is how long you may have to notify the other party or to start the litigation, and then you may have a certain number of years to actually prosecute that. And I wouldn't worry about that for this course. I just want to I guess I had extra space in the PowerPoint slide, so I want to put that up there or something. But again, just be aware that a lot of these things we're talking about have time limits within which they must be executed or taken care of. All right, we'll talk about this and then I think we'll take a break. So termination, there's a lot of ways in which you can terminate a contract, and you don't have to perform in order to do that. Partial performance might be adequate, particularly if it's acceptable or normal. Substantial performance is really, really, really common in some industries. So construction, for example. So let's say that your client buys new construction, and the closing is scheduled for August 28th, and on August 28th, the house isn't completely done. The alarm system hasn't been installed, but everything else is there. And the builder is insisting that your client close as scheduled. What do you think? Have they performed, or has the builder performed or not performed?
I think they performed.
You're getting everything you wanted, except the alarm's maybe going to be installed 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, whatever. The builder probably has a pretty good case for substantial performance. So in construction, we oftentimes call this substantial completion. And it's not at all uncommon to submit your final bill for all of the dollars when you still have a few things left to do. Touch up painting, the wrong doorknob on one of the doors, or something like that.
Can you hold back a percentage of everything?
Yeah, well, normally in construction, there's something called retainage. And so what happens is as contractors are going along, 5 or 10% of the money that's due to them is being withheld. But when you come down to the end, have they performed or not performed in terms of damages, et cetera? If they've substantially performed, then they're probably in good stead in the contract, even though you might not release that retainage until at the very, very, very end. It depends upon how the contract is written and what you've got going on. I don't know that they do retainage in home construction, but for what construction that I'm used to, that kind of retainage is commonplace. Big dollars. It's sort of the way the owner holds your feet to the fire. If you don't do this, we're not going to pay you your retainage. Impossibility of performance. So you enter into an agreement to build a house in Sugar Grove for the head mullah of the Nur province of Iran. And then the federal government passes a law that says you can't do that. You now can't fulfill your obligations under the contract. The contract is discharged. It's over. Unusual that you see that kind of thing in real estate, but it happens in other areas. Right? There were plenty of companies, American companies, doing business with Iran or some other country that then faces sanctions, and then you can't do it anymore. So impossible to perform. It's now illegal. So that automatically ends the contract. There's also something I don't have up here called impracticability of performance, where you can perform it, but the cost all of a sudden would be so ridiculous you may not be obligated to, and that's going to be the judgment by the judgment of a court. Something catastrophic happens, and some material you need, it just isn't available, or it's available but it's not available at any reasonable cost or a timeline. Mutual agreement, clearly the parties can have what sometimes we refer to as a satisfaction in a court, where they just simply negotiate a change of the contract during its executory period and make a change. Operation of law, I kind of gave you an example of that already under impossibility of performance. And then rescission, where maybe one party is still obligated to perform, but the other one is not. So you can rescind the contract if you have the obligation. If the other party has an obligation, but they have a problem, you could rescind it and let them out. It's not too dissimilar from mutual agreement, but there's no real change. You're the one who kind of holds it in the balance and just decide, no, you know what, we'll just let it go. So these are all different ways in which you can terminate a contract or discharge people's obligations underneath it when you get to those points. Impossibility of performance also happens when one of the parties to the contract dies. Now, in the case of a seller, technically you live on after you're dead. I don't know, I'm not talking about the afterlife, but I'm speaking legally. The estates of many people like Babe Ruth and Einstein and Elvis, they're still alive and making more money than all of us together in this room. So if you're a seller of a piece of property and you die, your estate might be obligated to follow through with the contract obligations. But a buyer, that's going to come down to the circumstances, particularly if the lender's not going to make the buyer a loan because the buyer is deceased and the income is gone. That estate is probably not going to be obligated to perform. So death can fit under that impossibility or impracticability of performance as well. Questions about any of these at all? All right, well, let's take a break. Let's come back at, let's just say 10 till. That's about 12 minutes, but I always run a little bit late, so we'll start back then if we're all here and ready. Yes, ma'am?
You'll be issuing out like the quiz too.
Yeah, I have the quiz here, right, thanks for reminding me. In fact, I'll just put it, I'll put it right here, and then anybody who wants can go ahead and grab it right now. Yeah, you're welcome.